Today is November 6th, 2024, and my guest is author, poet, and translator Robert Chandler. Our topic for today is the art of translation, and in particular, his translations of the work of Vasily Grossman. This is a follow-up to our recent conversation with Tyler Cowan on Grossman's masterpiece, Life and Fate. Robert, welcome to EconTalk.
Hello, glad to be speaking to you.
I want to start with just the logistics of a project like translating a nearly 900-page book, and you've done it twice for Grossman, both his work Stalingrad and Life and Fate. How do you prepare for a project like that? What research do you do, if any? How do you execute that enormous challenge?
There's no general answer. I suppose really it's just a step at a time. It's perhaps easier to talk about Stalingrad because that's more recent and it was also more complex. I had very little idea what was involved to begin with. I'd read in several places that there were 9 different complete versions of the novel in the archives in Moscow. And when the historian Jochen Hellbeck had encouraged me to go to to use the archival version, I just thought that was a non-starter because I was not going to be living long enough to collate 9 different versions of a long novel. So I expected to be staying with the version that was finally printed. But 2 things happened. First, I realized that there were actually 3 different versions, only moderately different versions, published in the course of 5 or 6 years. So in 1952, while Stalin was still alive, a heavily censored version was published. In 1954, a slightly less censored version was published. So that was after Stalin's death. And in 1956, when the Khrushchev thaw had begun, a considerably freer version was published. So I could get a clear idea from the differences between those versions, what kind of things were unacceptable to the censors, and what kind of things Grossman was clearly wanting to insert when he could. I then also got a very helpful guidance from a scholar in Moscow, Yuri Bit-Yunan, pointing out that there weren't actually 9 complete versions, that there was one version that had got lost anyway, an early typescript that was clearly the freest and really most interesting and original, and then 2 or 3 versions that were somewhat more Grossman trying to accommodate editorial demands, and then there were other bits that were just they weren't complete versions. There were sort of 40 pages that got added in at a late point. Anyway, from comparing those 3 published versions, I understood what Grossman wanted, and basically what was being omitted, what was being deleted by the censors was everything undignified. It's a battle of Stalingrad. This is a kind of grand Soviet triumph. So, nothing but absolute sort of dignity and nobility was acceptable. So, all Grossman's jokes, all Grossman's sort of moments of irony, all the bits where kind of an important general was being a bit silly, being frivolous or selfish or sort of being more interested in getting hold of some good food than he should have been. They were all edited out from the earlier versions. Even mentions of Grossman's frequent mentions of lice and fleas and things, they all, 90% of them were being edited out. So it was quite clear, it was a real education in the nature of Soviet censorship. Much more a matter of tone rather than just subject matter. And so I kind of felt I had enough understanding that I could now look at the early typescript and decide, which bits from it should deserve to be included in our version.
How long did that take once you got started? Once you were content with which manuscript you were going to use or the combinations with the parts put back in, how long a period would it take to translate a book like Stalingrad or Life and Fate? And were they different in terms of the length it took you to finish?
Very different indeed. Stalingrad, I can never really answer these questions very well because some periods I'm working consistently, sometimes I'm being interrupted. And certainly at least 2.5 years or so that I was working on Stalingrad most of the time. Life and Fate was a rather odd story. I spent a very long time feeling depressed and achieving very, very little indeed, and getting way, way behind. Then I had an extraordinary offer. A French translation was published and got rave reviews. And my contract was with the English publisher who had, sold rights to Harper and Row in America. Normally, I wouldn't have been getting any money from Harper and Row at all. But Harper and Row got very excited by the reviews of the French translation. And I think this was probably about February of whatever year it was. They offered me $10,000 extra if I completed the book by the beginning of September. 7.5 if I finished it by mid-September, and 5 if I finished it by the end of September. So I'm not very good at just sort of sitting at a desk and working for hours on end. I need physical exercise if my brain is to function. I rented a cottage, a flat by the sea in Cornwall, and basically was a hermit for 4 months. I kind of swam and walked every day. The rest of the time I was working. So I did at least 2/3 of the novel in about 4 or 5 months, and actually translated it working much better than I had done previously. And I got the $7,500. Not 1,000.
That's really, that's kind of extraordinary. I read the book. I read Life and Fate over, I don't know, probably a month or two. Unfortunately, I had other work and I wasn't being paid a premium to read it in a short period of time. But in the course of doing that, you, as a reader, become immersed in the characters' lives. You inevitably feel Vasily Grossman over your shoulder, and you develop a kinship with him and with his characters. What's it like to translate and spend day in, day out with that level of intensity? Is there an emotional reaction to that experience that's different than mine, say, as a reader? I assume there is.
Probably not so very different. I mean, more intense. But Grossman is someone I can most of the time, quite happily spend a lot of time with, because he does seem even the most awful passages of his writing, like the Treblinka article and the account of the terror famine in Everything Flows, even in those pieces, I always have a sense that he's not out to hurt the reader. He's not like some readers. Sorry, he's not like some writers imagining that if he sort of throws his pain at the reader, it will make life easier for him. He just knows that there is an important story that needs to be told, and he's telling it. he didn't particularly go out of his way to, fate led him to these places like Stalingrad and Treblinka. He's not out to hurt the reader. He does seem like a wise guide. I mean, I have sometimes thought of him, particularly with regard to Treblinka, I have thought of him as a kind of Virgil figure leading Dante through hell.
Yeah.
So I can, even on those painful subjects, I don't, with very few exceptions, I don't find it overwhelming.
When you're in that cottage in Cornwall, are there specific books you brought with you or that you had to have brought to you to do the job, or were you able to just sit with pen or keyboard, whatever technology you used? Did you need research and other things along the way? Did you need charts and maps to keep track of characters? And was that hard?
It's sort of hard to remember those days because we're so able to find things out on the internet. And this was the early 1980s. I didn't have much research material with me. I mean, there were a few people I remember, or it's at least one brigadier whom I could ask about military matters, but that was by post. There was a good, much older translator, Harry Willett, who Collins Harville engaged to check through the translation. He corrected a few errors. There was some, there were factual errors which I made then, which I wouldn't make now, like sort of, especially perhaps with German proper names and so on, because I'm not familiar with them. I sometimes misunderstood, I think, misunderstood place names and so on. But there wasn't, and there was time for, minor factual errors to be corrected during the editorial process.
Did you have a dictionary or more than one?
Russian English dictionaries are very poor. They still are. Grossman doesn't actually use that many unusual words. But yes, I mean, it is a huge, huge difference because I'm from then to the present day. Because nowadays, I mean, there's a very, very good, very welcoming and generous email forum called Sea Langs. That's SEE Langs, Slavonic and East European languages. And it's several thousand people. Most of them, or a high proportion, are American academics, Russianists in different universities. Quite a number of them are, were brought up in the Soviet Union, and I am notorious for the huge number of questions I ask on that forum, which people enjoy. People actually are extraordinarily helpful and do actually enjoy being asked questions. And how I managed to do Life and Fate without such without that at my fingertips, it's hard to remember.
I made a reference in the last episode with Tyler about Life and Fate that someone on X named high-piled_books, when we promoted the idea of a book club, he responded and said, I'm now on page 12. He or she, I don't know whether it's a he or she. I'm now on page 12 and everyone is called Stroganoff. Please push the pod back 6 months. It is a challenge especially I think for non-Russian readers, to keep track of the characters, even when there's a list in the back. He has an inordinate number. It's not the right word, but he has a very large number of characters. There's, I think, about 100 names in the back of Life and Fate. There's about 10 who are major characters, but it's a tremendously large number. How did you deal with that as a translator? Was that challenging?
In that case, I did. I didn't do the book in the order of pages. I did all the Strum chapters. Then I did all the Novikov chapters.
Oh, wow.
Then I did each thread. Of course, that couldn't be quite consistent because the threads sometimes met together. But nevertheless, I find that a little bit easier in that time.
Fabulous.
With as regards names, there's a nightmare chapter in Stalingrad, which is, I'm sure I've made a great deal easier for the English reader than it would have been for a Russian reader. There's a chapter in Stalingrad where Strum is with a crowd of very, very senior ministers and engineers and so on in Moscow. They're discussing the relocation of industry to the east, the Urals and Siberia, and there are probably about a dozen men. They are all men, and Grossman has it seems to me excessive. Russians tend to have a rather excessive fear of repetition, but Grossman seemed to be going out of his way to refer to the same person in sort of 4 or 5 different ways. So one point it would be the engineer from the Urals, and then a page later this same man would be referred to by his surname. Another page later, it might be the bespectacled engineer. And I did have to do a kind of table of all the different ways in which a particular character was being referred to. And there was absolutely no way, people go on a lot about sort of being faithful to eccentricities in the original and so on. There's absolutely no way I was going to reproduce that literally. So I did in my translation refer to people more consistently, not to make matters more difficult than necessary for the reader.
In general, must be an issue that you have to make choices as a translator. I personally was encouraged by one of my teachers, Deirdre McCloskey, writing as an economist to avoid what is sometimes called elegant variation. That is to choose a different word when you meant the thing that you talked to a few sentences or words earlier, because sometimes that repetition can jar the reader's ear, but the reader can get confused. So I tend to be more of a repeater. And in particular, I'm also a fan, could just be a character flaw, but sometimes I think repetition is very powerful. It creates a chorus. It creates a rhythm and a beat in a paragraph or a page. And if Russians don't like that as writers generally, do you try to maintain, except in this case of confusion with names, I'm thinking more about adjectives, say, do you try to maintain their variation in English that they had in the original Russian, and not just in this case of identifying a character?
I think many people are much too afraid of repetition. And I share your feelings about so-called elegant repetition. I mean, there's a particular annoying thing which annoys me in a lot of Russian writers, is they seem afraid of just using a simple word like he said or he answered. They will endlessly it'll be he said, he pronounced, he uttered, he goodness me, he exclaimed, I don't believe it, he astonished. Used as sort of astonished as a way of introducing speech, where it's doubling up. It's if the man is saying, I don't believe it. We don't need to make that, explicit in the verb as well. So no, in that case, I certainly just go for he said, which seems much less obtrusive. And
yeah, it's so interesting. When I talked to Tyler Cowen, he wanted to ask you if there's more humor in Life and Fate in the Russian than there is in the English. He found, quote, no humor in the English. Could be a statement about Tyler, but he also confessed that his wife, who is Russian, will often laugh at things that he doesn't see the humor in. Is there, and you alluded to the humor of Stalingrad, is there humor in Life and Fate that doesn't come through in the English, that you just weren't able to bring it in? Or is it just pretty much a humorless book?
I don't think there's humor that I failed to bring in. I'm interested by what you say, and wondering whether there perhaps is more humor in Stalingrad. I was surprised. My much elder brother was tremendously enthusiastic about the Stalingrad. He really, really loved it, and then, to my surprise, seemed to just find Life and Fate unrelentingly grim and not really to enjoy it at all. And I wonder whether humor is a part of it. I mean, there's a certain amount of irony I can think of.
Yes.
Life and Fate. But the difference between the two novels is that Stalingrad is much closer to, there are a lot of passages in it which are quite close to repetitions or paraphrasing of passages from his wartime notebooks. There's a lot of little funny incidents, funny turns of speech in Stalingrad, which are clearly just real life things that he witnessed. Life and Fate is it's more distant from the reality of the time. It's much more of a kind of serious moral and philosophical statement. In a way, Stalingrad is more of a novel, and Life and Fate more of a sort of, as I said, a philosophical and moral study. So perhaps there is less humor in it.
I mean, it's a sort of it's a pretty grim book, and there are many, many grim parts to it. But as I suggested in that episode conversation with Tyler, I did not find it bleak at all. In fact, parts of it I found quite uplifting. We can talk a little bit about that later, maybe. I'm thinking of Solzhenitsyn, who in the Gulag and in the First Circle, which we talked about on this program, they're all grim, but there's a lot of humor in Solzhenitsyn. He has funny passages. I mean, if you contrast in the First Circle, the full version, not the original censored one that he self-censored, the passages about Stalin, especially the long chapter about Stalin, is quite, well, it's bittersweet. It's funny and it's dark humor, I would call it. But he also has many set pieces that are comic. A lot of it's dark humor, but he just strikes me as a much more humorous writer about the bleak things and grim things than Grossman. I don't know if that's fair.
It's not really for me to judge. It's a long time since I read of the First Circle, so probably you're right, but I can't say any more.
Let's talk about Grossman's feelings about Stalinism and communism, the Soviet system generally. In my very casual reading about him, Stalingrad is less critical of the Soviet regime, much more triumphant about it's much more patriotic, nationalist. Certainly by lifetime, we're reading Life and Fate. It's a much more critical portrait, and the parallels between the Nazi characters and the Nazi system, and the Soviet characters and the Soviet system, the parallels between Hitler and Stalin are much more. I mean, you can't avoid them. How do you think Grossman's attitude towards his country and the regime he lived under changed over time? How is there a simple-ish way to tell that story?
It used to get very, very oversimplified indeed, as if Grossman were, simply a good Stalinist, and then suddenly he metamorphosed. Yeah. And that's absolutely not true. I mean, he was, all the way through his career, he was always pushing at the boundaries of what was acceptable. So his, the wartime articles he wrote for Red Star, which we're translating at present. I mean, he was writing for a military newspaper. He was obviously not going to be criticizing Stalin in it. But there's actually remarkably little mention of Stalin. And there's a very interesting story that the editor of Red Star, the very good David Ortenberg, who was edited till, I think, summer 1943, he commissioned Grossman to write an article titled Tsaritsyn Stalingrad. Now, this city on the Volga that during the war was called Stalingrad, until 1924 it was called Tsaritsyn, and it's now called Volgograd. So that's one and the same city. So Ortenberg was really inviting and expecting Grossman to write an article about how Stalin, who did play an important role in defending Tsaritsyn from the Whites in the Civil War, that's why, part of the rationale for changing its name to Stalingrad. So Ortenberg was expecting Grossman to be drawing a parallel between Stalin defending Tsaritsyn in 1919, I think, and the Red Army defending Stalingrad in 1942. And Grossman wrote an article without mentioning Stalin. So he was being challenging all the time. The Red Star editors were, well, Ortenberg got fired anyway, so the editing probably got worse, but they were messing up his articles a great deal. Grossman complains about this bitterly in some of his letters. So, they were often adding sort of ultra-patriotic bits to them. I mean, Grossman really, did the minimum of the kind of Soviet grandiose style. He certainly, I'm sure his feelings about the system were ambivalent towards the end. I mean, I remember giving a talk once at Pushkin House in London, and I was talking quite a lot about Grossman drawing parallels between Stalin's Soviet Union and Hitler's Germany. And I remember this very, very sweet Russian woman coming up to me and saying that she just couldn't quite understand how, on the one hand, what I'd just been saying could be true, and yet that Grossman, right to the end of his life, would enjoy singing sort of patriotic Red Army songs, over when people have been eating and drinking together, and Grossman would enjoy singing these patriotic songs. So it was his world. I mean, it's and of course if it however much you might draw parallels between Hitler and Stalin, nevertheless, it was Hitler who had annihilated millions of Jews, and the Soviet Union was his world. Was Grossman's world.
Yeah. Well,
people have contradictory feelings.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, as you can feel it in Life and Fate, it's not easy being a Jew in Soviet Russia. Certainly, at various times it was extremely unpleasant, but it's nothing like Nazi Germany, obviously. But there's something in those parallels between an authoritarian system where the state is supreme that he seems quite fascinated by in Life and Fate. And I remarked in the earlier conversation about Life and Fate with Tyler Cowen that as a non-Soviet expert, to realize that the Soviets had commissars and other officers as the Germans had SS officers, both looking to uncover heresy about the regime in the middle of a war, not a small war, a life and death existential war, was quite extraordinary. And so the parallels that those characters are forced to confront is, to me, one of the most powerful parts of Life and Fate. Obviously, they're not the same system. Obviously, they have similar things, though, and Grossman must have felt that very strongly.
Absolutely. And it was actually the very first chapter of Life and Fate I translated was the dialogue between the SS officer Lise and the old Bolshevik Mostovskoy.
Yeah.
I translated that for what was then the rather important journal. I mean, it's still going, but it was more important at the time than is now, Index on Censorship. So they published my translation of that chapter, and along with a kind of summary, a kind of article of mine about the novel. So that's what got a publisher interested. And I did, I find that dialogue absolutely riveting myself.
Unbelievable. It's an unbelievable section of the book, and you feel like the Russian is, through some significant portion of it, putting his hands over his ears and going, because he doesn't want to hear or confront, even imagine the possibility. And at the same time, knowing something about interrogation, he's constantly thinking, well, this isn't what he really thinks. It's just to get me to confess or for me to be broken. But he's also wondering, as are we the readers, maybe this is from the heart. This is a man having a moment of intense self-awareness, the German, that he has a kinship to this communist. It's an extraordinary, extraordinary section of the book.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are there portions in a book like Life and Fate? I mean, there are extraordinary passages. There's that have incredible emotional weight. There's the letter that Victor's mother writes that is presumably Grossman's imagining what his own mother would have written if she had had a chance to write him before her death at the hands of the Nazis. I mentioned the incredible scene where German soldiers come to avenge the death of some Germans at the hands of the Russians. And a Russian woman, I'll come back and talk about this later, but faces a moral dilemma. There's an unbearable scene where a woman and a child are killed in a Nazi death camp. When you're translating those, do you find yourself spending more time on them? Because they pack such emotional power. And I can't judge how much of that was in Grossman and how much of that is Chandler, but they're really they're unforgettable. And I'm just curious, do you spend more time on those, getting the wording the way you want them? The poetry effectively is what you're translating there.
Not necessarily. As an interesting example is the terror famine chapter in Everything Flows.
Yeah, brutal.
That is absolutely crystal clear. It was very straightforward to translate. The woman who is narrating the chapter she keeps repeating the word "I saw." So kind of, I saw this, I saw that, and I saw this. It's absolutely straight. There's no backtracking, no sort of saying something and then qualifying it. It's absolutely straight narrative. It was emotionally overwhelming, but it was actually very easy to translate because it was so simple and clear. And the absolute opposite to that in the same book is the equivocations of the main character, the scientist, who is sort of looking back on his past, and he's constantly sort of trying to be honest and then running away from being honest. So he'll be saying he keeps using the word, instead of I saw, it's kazalas, it seemed to me. And then he was sort of, or did it really seem to me? And it had seemed, getting the tense right was terribly, terribly difficult in English, because in Russian they actually only have present, future, and past. So sometimes, in English, when you're translating, you have to think a lot whether it should be it seemed, it had seemed, whatever. So those kind of equivocations were, which Grossman is very, very skilled at, as in other chapters as well, where he says something and then he kind of backtracks, or his character backtracks, and so on. Those are the ones that are difficult to translate.
Everything Flows is a much shorter Grossman novel for those listening, and it's imperfect. But it's still an extraordinary read, and well, maybe we'll talk about it a little more later. It deals, as you mentioned, with the famine and the deaths of the kulak, of millions of kulaks, over just an unbearable time of human history, just the cruelty of it. And Grossman captures it in a very, very powerful way. But I want to turn to The Road and bring it back to Life and Fate. The Road is a short story of Grossman's, and it's the title as well of an edited volume that you did of his shorter writings. So it includes short stories, it includes essays. The two most extraordinary essays in there for me were The Hell of Treblinka, which we've already spoken about, and a rather remarkable essay, which I alluded to I mentioned briefly in the previous conversation with Tyler Cowen, The Sistine Madonna. And then so the short stories. But the other thing that makes the book special is that you've written many sections of biographical material about Grossman and the writings, the stories and the essays. And in particular, I'd like you to talk a little bit about Grossman's relationship with his mother. As I mentioned, in Life and Fate, there's a letter from Victor's mother that is presumably the letter that Grossman himself imagined his mother could have written to him. But we also have two letters that he wrote to his mother in the book The Road, that Grossman wrote to his mother after her death, 9 years after her death, 20 years after her death, two letters. He dedicated life and fate to his mother. He believed very strongly that she was still alive in the form of the book, as in some sense. So talk about that, and it's really an extraordinary theme, the theme of maternal love, that is very, very powerful and commonly invoked in life and fate. Tell us about that.
A great many of Grossman's works do bring in the theme of maternal love. You've mentioned the scene in the gas chamber where an unmarried, childless female doctor, in a way, kind of adopts his little 8-year-old boy on the way to the gas chamber. And it's one of her dying thoughts as she is holding this little boy is, I've become a mother. Grossman does repeatedly manage to sort of find maternal love, occasionally put different versions, sometimes reversing the generations in the most terrible situations. So there's another story where there's a lonely old school teacher, a Jewish school teacher, who is about to be shot. He's with the Jews from that city have all been led out to an execution site, and he's feeling very, very lonely, deeply lonely, and a child who he knows comes up behind him and puts, I think it's her arms, I can't quite remember, puts her hands over his eyes and says, "Don't look," i.e. don't look at the Jews being executed, being shot just ahead of us. So there you've got a kind of a little child playing the parental role.
Yeah.
So that's what I meant by the generations being reversed. But
yeah,
is constantly finding those kind of situations in the most. He's finding those relationships in the most ghastly situations. And there's a very touching article by Grossman's daughter, Katya, who didn't write a great deal about her father. But she wrote an article about the story called Amama, and she points out that there are about, I think, 8 or 9 kind of mothers and adoptive mothers and nurses playing a maternal role, and so different substitute mothers of one kind or another. So at one level, it's a very bleak story about centered on the family of Yezhov, the head of the NKVD at the height of Stalin's purges in the late 1930s. So it's, at one level, it's about this evil figure, Yezhov. And also, it is about maternal tenderness. There are a huge number of tender maternal figures in it. One of the other striking things about the relationship with the mother is that, Grossman clearly felt a huge weight of guilt that he could have, in the very first weeks of the war, he could have traveled to Berdichev and fetched his mother and brought her back to relative safety in Moscow. She couldn't do that on her own. She was partly disabled. And in any case, at that point, people didn't realize how quickly the Germans were going to advance. Grossman didn't fetch her, partly because his wife didn't want that, which was later a cause of bitterness between husband and wife. But anyway, however much Grossman may have blamed his wife, he certainly blamed himself. And he did. Usually guilt is a fairly incapacitating feeling. I think it's rather unusual that Grossman was able to turn this weight, to really use this weight of guilt in such a positive way. So in Life and Fate, when Stroom, after he's been sort of blessed by Stalin, and Stalin has realized the importance of nuclear research, when Stroom is in a fortunate position again, and he capitulates and signs a letter, signs an official letter criticizing various Jews. Stroom feels deeply ashamed of himself, and he, prays to his mother, sort of, next time, give me your strength, lend me your strength, mother. So he is seeing his mother as a source of strength.
Yeah, it's a very. There were a couple of. I felt that in that sequence of events, he was, I don't know, dealing with his own challenges of conscience in his own life. And then similarly, his own marriage in real life, Grossman's own marriage, was a bit of a mess. And he has some of that mess in Life and Fate, but it's not quite the same. The character in Life and Fate doesn't make the same decisions that Grossman makes in his own life with respect to a woman he's fallen for outside of his marriage. And I feel like it's some kind of penance on his part, or some kind of idealization of his own situation.
I missed a word then. Some kind of what on his part?
Idealization. That he's imagining how he wished he had behaved in his own life, but he did not behave that way in his own life.
Mm-hmm. Right. Grossman's, some biographers have written rather critically of Grossman's wife. She did do a great deal of rather heroic work, kind of typing out his manuscripts, even the chapters in Life and Fate, that are based on Grossman's unfaithfulness to her. She's a bit like Tolstoy's wife. She did, I think, put up with quite a lot from him.
And when we think about what people might read, I would really recommend the book The Road, and this is the shorter collection of essays and short stories and the biographical material that you've written. We mentioned Everything Flows, which is a shorter novel. And I mention these only because some of you out there, I'm sure, are intimidated or not interested in an 872-page sprawling, polyphonic, 100-character novel about Stalingrad and 9,000 other things, because it's not really about Stalingrad. One of the most, as a newcomer to Grossman, when people say, oh, Life and Fate's about the Battle of Stalingrad, I'm thinking, well, I'm not sure I want to read a war novel. It's not really about the Battle of Stalingrad. It's about the human condition, every single aspect of it: love, betrayal, heroism, courage, kindness, cruelty, war, infidelity, marriage. It's an amazing book, but if it's long. So I just want to put in a plug for The Road, and I'd like you to, if you'd like to read an excerpt from one of the stories in that collection, or say anything else about what you think readers should do who would like to taste Grossman but not sure they're ready for the epic of Life and Fate, or Stalingrad, or his book Stalingrad, the prequel.
I really love his last short stories, the ones he wrote after the typescript of Life and Fate was confiscated. So the three stories I particularly love are the title story, The Road, which is it's told from the point of view of an Italian mule that is dragging artillery shells from presumably Italy right all the way across Europe to Stalingrad. There's a great deal of humour in it.
Yes, there is.
Perhaps fancifully, I see it as a mini Life and Fate, that sort of Grossman trying to compensate for the loss of his novel by kind of condensing it into a little tiny version. Some of that is very funny indeed. And you get the sort of mule being quite philosophical, learning about concepts like infinity from crossing this vast Russian plain. I love The Dog, which is about a mongrel dog that was caught on a Moscow street, taken to a laboratory, and ends up being fictionally, the kind of first animal sent into space. Again, it's got a lot of humor in it. The sort of basic plot is that there's this very, very emotionally detached scientist who is in charge of the mission under this dog. He gets deeply emotionally attached to the dog, and he kind of imagines that when the dog comes back to Earth after having been up in space, he'll be able to gaze into the dog's eyes and sort of see the secrets of cosmic space in them. And I was very struck that a friend of mine, a poet who, at that time didn't know much about Grossman, and I sent her a draft of that story when I was working on it, and she thanked me and said it's really shamanic. And of course, I'm sort of so used to thinking of Grossman as being quite sort of a rationalist and someone who wrote a lot about the war and, about difficult moral questions. I'd never really thought of him as being shaman-like, but I could sort of, it was very interesting sometimes getting a perspective of someone who had all the sort of package of knowledge about Grossman. And the story we've already mentioned, Mama, extraordinary story where we are in a way in the heart of evil in the household of NKVD boss Yezhov, but we actually see Yezhov through totally innocent eyes, through the eyes of a 5-year-old orphan whom his family have adopted. That's based on a real life story, and through the eyes of the girl's peasant nanny, who doesn't have a clue what's going on in the country politically. And, she actually, I think Grossman says may have been the only person in the country who felt sorry for Yezhov, because, she could look in his eyes and see that something was wrong, but she sort of didn't understand anything on a grander scale. But I'd love to just read from the very first page of The Dog, which kind of, it sort of epitomizes a kind of a lighter side of Grossman that sometimes gets rather forgotten. Gets forgotten not so much because there isn't, there is lightness and humor in nearly all his work, but so much of his work is actually the subject matter is very grim, like Stalingrad and Treblinka, that it's easy to think of that, of Grossman himself being grim. The Dog. Her childhood was hungry and homeless. Nevertheless, childhood is the happiest time of life. Her first May Those spring days on the edge of town was especially good. The smell of earth and young grass filled her soul with happiness. She felt a piercing, almost unbearable sense of elation. Sometimes she was too happy even to feel like eating. All day long there was a warm green mist in her head and her eyes. She would drop down on her front paws in front of a dandelion and let out happy, angry, childish, staccato yelps. She was asking the flower to join in and run about with her. And the stillness of its stout little green leg surprised her and made her cross. And then all of a sudden, she would be frenziedly digging a hole. Clods of earth would fly out from under her little belly, and her pink and black paws would get almost burned by the stony earth. Her little face would take on a troubled look. She seemed not to be playing a game. She seemed to be digging a refuge, digging for dear life. She had a plump pink belly, and her paws were broad, even though she ate little during that good time of her life. It was as if she were growing plump from happiness, from the joy of being alive. Then eventually winter comes, life gets a bit more difficult, and we learn about how this dog learns to cope with the difficulties of city life. She knew the murderous power of cars and trucks and had a precise knowledge of their different speeds. She knew how to wait patiently while the traffic went by, how to rush across the road when the cars were stopped by a red light. She knew the forward-sweeping, all-destroying force of electric trains and their childish helplessness. As long as it was a few inches away from the track, even a mouse was safe from them. She knew the roars, whistles, and rumbles of jet and propeller planes, as well as the racket of helicopters. She knew the smell of gas pipes. She knew where she might find the warmth given off by hot water pipes running under the ground. She knew the work rhythm of the town's garbage trucks. She knew how to get inside garbage containers of all kinds, and could immediately recognize the cellophane wrapping around meat products and the waxed paper around cod, rockfish, and ice cream. A black electric cable sticking up out of the earth was more horrifying to her than a viper. Once she'd put a damp paw on a cable with a broken insulating jacket. This dog probably knew more about technology than an intelligent, well-informed person from 3 centuries before her. It was not merely that she was clever, she was also educated. Had she failed to learn about mid-20th century technology, she would have died. After all, dogs that wandered into the city from some village or other often lasted only a few hours. I'd like to just mention that my late friend Igor Golemstok, it was he who actually first put Life and Fate my way and said I should translate it, which initially I just laughed at him and said I don't read books that long in Russian, let alone translate them. And but in particular, in this instance, I remembered him because when I was choosing stories for the road, there was a moment when I began to sort of worry a bit that a huge proportion of the stories I'd chosen seemed to have to do with animals and kind of, was I being sentimental? And so Igor was one of the least sentimental people I've ever known. So I asked him, I gave him a list of stories, and he actually chose almost the same stories as I had. So I felt confident that I wasn't just being sentimental. But Grossman clearly was very fond of animals, and I think that extract does show how he does try quite hard to sort of enter into their lives.
Well, I mentioned to you in an email before we had this interview that the road, which is about the mule, reminded me a lot of the Tolstoy story Pace Setter, which is about a horse. And Pace Setter is, I think, a masterpiece, an extraordinarily unknown, relatively unknown, and yet unbelievably powerful story, which uses this shtick essentially of the sentient horse or mule, in this case a horse, to make observations about humanity that humans often miss, and to be exposed to human frailty and comment on it from an animal's perspective, which makes it somehow more poignant. I'm curious. I assume Grossman knew that story.
Oh yes, it's well known in Russia.
Yeah, unlike say here or in the West generally. Did Grossman have a favorite Russian writer or favorite novel that was not his own? And does Robert Chandler have a favorite Russian author who's not named Grossman?
Grossman loved Chekhov. I'm sure that Chekhov was his favorite writer. He did read War and Peace several times during the war. So Tolstoy was important to him, but I think his love of Chekhov was deeper. The Russian writer I love equally with Grossman is Andrei Platonov, who was, though a very, very different writer to Grossman, the two of them were very close friends, especially during the last 10 years or so of Platonov's life. Platonov is a more unusual writer than Grossman. He uses language in a very, very unusual way. He's a great deal harder to translate, which is why he's less known in Western European countries than Grossman. A lot of Russians, especially Russian writers, see Platonov as the greatest writer of the last century. And as I began to say, he and Grossman, their sort of careers went in almost opposite ways. Grossman began as a journalist, and towards the end of his life was sort of writing more and more poetically and succinctly. Platonov began as a poet and writing very, very unusual prose, putting words together in unusual ways. And as his life went on, he wrote more and more simply and straightforwardly. Late Grossman, stories like the Mule, there's a definite influence of Platonov there. Grossman was, he gave the main speech at Platonov's funeral. He was on the committee that was trying to get Platonov's work published in the 1950s. Both writers were kind of borderline as far as the Soviet authorities were concerned. Platonov still more so. About half of Platonov's work was not published at all during his lifetime, and the other half was published and then fiercely criticized.
I will read some. I didn't know of him until I reached out to you and saw that you translated him. Do you have a favorite translator, by the way, of Russian into English? You mentioned Harry Willits, who I think is a translator of some of Solzhenitsyn. You can go back and people still read the Constance Garnett. I'm a big fan of Constance Garnett's translation of the Brothers Karamazov, but I have no idea if it's, quote, a good translation. I just enjoy her style. Do you have favorites in that world? You must.
Yes, I certainly do. And Constance Garnett is always something of a test case for me. If people say there was a time when people were constantly sneering at her, and that immediately made me feel hostile towards them. She was a very, very strong, courageous, independent woman. She translated probably 4 or 5 great writers well enough that people could recognize that they were great writers. That's quite something. It's easy enough to pick holes in some passages from her work, but she translated a huge amount. She taught herself Russian, basically. She didn't have all the kind of dictionaries available. She had the good sense, which a lot of translators don't have, to get a Russian friend to check her work. She'd be, paying him to do that. I admire her immensely. And when I was translating stories for a Penguin Classics anthology of Russian short stories, 19th and 20th century, to begin with, because for the 19th century, most of my choices were very standard choices, like The Queen of Spades and The Greatcoat. So they had been translated quite a few times already. And I would begin by having several different translations open on my desk. And in that, almost always, Constance Garnett was better in every way than the other ones. Sometimes she understood things correctly, which the other translators then misunderstood. And if they'd bothered to look at her translation, they would have not made that particular mistake. So I do greatly admire her. Of younger translators, I very much admire Boris Dralyuk, who has done outstanding translations of Isaac Barbil, of the contemporary Ukrainian writer, Ukrainian Russophone writer Andrei Kurkov, and a great deal of poetry. He's done. He's constantly unearthing unknown Russian emigres who ended up in Los Angeles and so on, and translating. He's a very good translator of poetry. So I admire him greatly. Michael Glennie also translated rather a lot, possibly a bit too much. Sometimes perhaps he was working a bit too fast and make sort of minor factual errors. But he knows how he can write. So I still prefer his Master and Margarita to other versions. I probably shouldn't say any more, because if I say too many names, then
I'm sure there are many others you like too. We'll just leave it at that.
To people whom I don't mention, but
well, we didn't have time. That's okay. I was going to say something about the Sistine Madonna, but I'm not going to. I will just say this. What you write about it before the essay is so extraordinary. And had you not, I'm not going to spoil it, but had you not written what you wrote about the person in Siberia and the taiga walking along with a log on his shoulder, I would have missed that in Grossman's essay. And that passage will haunt me for a long, long time. It's really Grossman's passage and your recognition of it. So I will just tell listeners, you should get The Road, the book, and you should read whatever in there you want. And in a way, his 45-page essay on Treblinka, which is said to be the first journalist to enter a death camp, a Nazi death camp. He makes some factual errors inevitably because of the nature of what he's doing, but his evocation of the cruelty of it and yet the heroism of the survivors and those who did not survive, the humanity of them, I should say, not the heroism, is unforgettable. And I've alluded to it a number of times on this program, but I would just encourage readers to read that. I do feel, I used to feel this way about Solzhenitsyn. I think I still do, and I certainly feel this way about Grossman, that in some sense, his work, their work, demands to be read, that they gave us a gift under unbearable duress that most of us never have to endure. And we owe it to their memories, especially Grossman, who didn't in his lifetime know about the eventual publication of Life and Fate. We owe it to them. We honor them by reading their work and their courage to say what they said, to say it the way they said it. So I'd encourage readers to read Life and Fate for sure. I'm looking forward to reading Stalingrad. I encourage people to read Everything Flows, the novel shorter one we mentioned, and certainly the shorter pieces in The Road that with your biographical material. I want to say one more thing, but you can react to that if you'd like.
No, I mean, I agree with every word you've just said. Remembering people, a lot of Grossman's work is itself a work of remembrance.
Yeah.
It's endlessly wanting to include names of people whom he respected, both important, both sort of well-known historical figures and kind of cooks and nurses and minor figures in Stalingrad who would tend to get forgotten about. He was always keen to include their names. He loves lists of names, remembering names, a bit like one remembers names in a prayer. So yes, I agree.
And in The Hell of Treblinka, he mentions how many people died there unnamed, unremembered, and yet this incredible irony that the Nazis saw the Jews as animals, as subhuman, but Grossman elevates the victims to the status, the very, very simple status of human being. It's that they're the murderers who are the beasts. And read that essay, folks. But I want to close with something else, which is a passage at the end of a document that appears in Life and Fate. It's a manifesto of, I don't know how to pronounce it, but and I might be getting it wrong, Ikonikov, that the old Bolshevik that you mentioned earlier finds, and he's reading it, and it ends like this. And this is this. I said I was going to say something about this woman who did this act of kindness, but I'll let readers read that in Life and Fate. But Grossman talks a lot about this concept of senseless kindness, and this is what he has this character say, and I'll let you respond to it. It goes like this. But the more I saw of the darkness of fascism, the more clearly I realized that human qualities persist even on the edge of the grave, even at the door of the gas chamber. My faith has been tempered in hell. My faith has emerged from the flames of the crematoria, from the concrete of the gas chamber. I have seen that it is not man who is impotent in the struggle against evil, but the power of evil that is impotent in the struggle against man. The powerlessness of kindness, of senseless kindness, is the secret of its immortality. It can never be conquered. The more stupid, the more senseless, the more helpless it may seem, the vaster it is. Evil is impotent before it. The prophets, religious teachers, reformers, social and political leaders are impotent before it. This dumb, blind love is man's meaning. Human history is not the battle of good struggling to overcome evil. It is a battle fought by a great evil struggling to crush a small kernel of human kindness. But if what is human in human beings has not been destroyed even now, then evil will never conquer. End of quote.
Thank you.
End of quote. And that belief, which I assume is his, even though he puts it in the mouth of another character that's not his avatar, Victor, is so extraordinary in the world he is immersed in. It's like a desperate optimism. It overwhelms me.
Thank you very much for reading that passage. And I will remember that phrase, desperate optimism. I, for a long time, was sort of rather puzzled that, I'd always loved that Ikonnikov chapter and found it both moving and profound, and was a bit puzzled that I sort of felt that most people were either not paying much attention to it or seeing it as perhaps rather naive or something. And then it is really in the last sort of few decades with a kind of revival of moral philosophy, which was very much out of fashion for a lot of the 20th century. And in particular, the philosopher, the Jewish-Lithuanian philosopher, Emanuel Levinas, who worships Grossman. It is only really relatively recently that moral statements like the one you've just read are sort of finally getting the attention they deserve.
My guest today has been Robert Chandler. Robert, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you very much.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.